Learners, today I am going to talk about novel and its development. The term novel is derived from Italian word novella, which meant a little new thing. It was used earlier for a short narrative in prose. The early examples of short narratives are found in Boccaccio's Decameron, which was a collection of short stories. There were also the tales of King Arthur, and we can also put in the category of such prose narratives. So, novel in its earlier form was a prosaic narratives which was fictitious. Now, the roots of modern novel actually lies in the medieval romances. These romances were fantastic tales of love and adventure. So, the very definition of earlier novel can be called romance. Romance means fantastic tales, and the limited thematic range was love and adventure. It had nothing to do with the real life and the real characters. The modern definition of novel is totally different. For example, the shorter Oxford Dictionary defines novel as a fictitious prose narrative of considerable length in which characters and actions representative of real life are portrayed in a plot of more or less complexity. According to this definition, novel is prosaic. It is not something written in verse. Secondly, it is of considerable length. It is not too short, not too long. Thirdly, the characters, they are real. They have to do something with reality. They are taken from the real life. And the novel has realistic approach to life and its problems. And there is a plot also. So we find out some elements of novel from this definition. When we come to the history of novel, we find that novel has taken a long journey to attain its modern form and definition. In the beginning, it was not so prosaic, it was not so realistic as it appears today. It had not the multifaceted forms of picaresque, domestic, gothic, psychological. All these aspects were totally missing in the earlier form of novel. It was only confined to the delineation of imaginary, something unrealistic, some tales which can be only expected in dreams, some dreamy life, some unbelievable events were there. Its earlier form was a prose romance, but with the passage of time, it acquired new dimensions, new meanings, and new forms. And there have been several novelists and writers who contributed to this development. They popularized it, made it one of the most lovable and popular form of literature. Nowadays, novel is the most readable and popular form of fiction. Novel acquired its modern form and meaning only in the 18th century. Although in the 17th century there were some features of novel in the works of Daniel Defoe, but it were only the four masters like Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne who gave its modern form and meaning. Richardson offered plot, character, and dialogue as the important and key elements of novel. He wrote novels in the form of letters. His novels can be called epistolary novels. He added sentiments, feelings to the novel. On the other hand, Fielding, he got the form of novel from Richardson and developed it in another direction. He gave the principle of novel that novel is a comic epic in prose. He insisted upon its prosaic form and also added realism to the form of novel. Smollett, he wrote picaresque novels, and Stern, he opened new possibilities of novel. For example, his novel has no plot. It is full of humor. He made novel totally sentimental and fantastic. Now, before we go to the 18th century novels, we find that there were some prose romances written before 18th century and they had some germs of novel in them. In the Elizabethan period, John Lilly's Euphues, Thomas Law's Rosaline, Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, they were written and they were prose romances. In the 17th century, John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress. It has also some qualities of novel. Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe, they were writing in the later part of the 17th century. They had also a good deal of contribution to the form of novel with their Gulliver's Travels, Robinson Crusoe, all these things. But the major novelists of the 18th century are Samuel Richardson. He wrote Pamela, Clarissa, Sir Charles Grandison. Henry Fielding wrote Joseph Andrews, Jonathan Wild, Tom Jones. Tobias Smollett wrote Roderick Random, Peregrine Pickle, and Lawrence Stern wrote a famous novel, Tristram Shandy. The four pillars of novel, Richardson, Henry Fielding, Smollett, and Stern are again here. Now, in the 18th century, novel attained new dimensions. We find that novel developed new forms. Domestic novel, for example, dealing with the domestic affairs of life, love, marriage, relationships, all these things. And the female novelist who contributed to this form was Jane Austen. On the other hand, there were some other writers who were attempting their head on writing the terror novels like Gothic novels, creating horror and terror through the imaginary stories and romantic stories located in some far castles. And the writers were Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, Gregory Lewis, and Clara Radcliffe, Anne Radcliffe. The novel of passion. There were some female writers and they were writing the novel of passion and terror both. Charlotte Bronte, she wrote Jane Eyre. Emily Bronte, she wrote Wuthering Heights. Their novels have the elements of passion. Now we find there also another form of novel, that is historical novel, and the master artist was Walter Scott. He wrote historical novel with an aim to retell the history with romantic and picturesque details. His novels are Waverley, Guy Mannering, Old Mortality, Ivanhoe, and Talisman. There were some realists like Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray. Charles Dickens, he was a great realist and novelist of 19th century. He wrote novels having complex plot, realism, humor, and pathos. His famous novels are David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, and Great Expectations. William Makepeace Thackeray, he was a rival of Charles Dickens in realism. He wrote novel of ideas. He also dealt with satire, irony, and realistic problems of the society. His famous novels are Vanity Fair and Henry Esmond. In the later part of the 19th century, we find some development in the field of regional novel through the hands of Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was a great philosopher, pessimist, and he revealed the innermost soul of the characters. His famous novels are The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of D'Urberville's Jude the Obscure. And the another great contributor to the form of novel was Henry James. He developed psychological novel. He introduced modern psychology in the novel and he wrote famous novels like The Portrait of a Lady, The Golden Bowl, The Wings of the Dove, The Turn of the Screw. In the 20th century, novel again became a mature form and it attained maturity. There were innovations in the form and structure of the novel. For example, the first example is the decay of the plot. Now, the plot and action was not important. The emphasis has shifted from plot to character's consciousness. The influence of Freud and William James was felt, and the new novel was called Stream of Consciousness novel. The writer had to concentrate on the stream of consciousness of the speaker. The writer and novelist focused on depicting the inner reality instead of the external reality, and they used interior monologue. There was use of ellipsis, indirect style, and enigma. The narrative technique was also developed and it was different from the earlier forms of novel. The important novelists in the 20th century are Henry James, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and D.H. Lawrence. Henry James wrote The Ambassador, The Wings of Dove. Virginia Woolf, she was a female novelist and she experimented with the stream of consciousness novel. Her famous novels are Mrs. Dalloway, The Leaves, To the Lighthouse, A Room of One's Own. James Joyce wrote Ulysses, a portrait of an artist as a young man, and D.H. Lawrence wrote Sons and Lovers and the Rainbow. Thanks for watching.